What's going on, guys? So here we have this single page application and it's using server-side sessions and is storing the user's session ID in a cookie. So whenever a user logs in or creates an account, their session is stored on the server in Redis and the cookie set on the browser to identify the user. The problem with that is that that cookie is a cross-site cookie because our front end and back end are separated from each other. So on browsers like Safari, when a user tries to log in, when they click login, they're just taken straight back to the login page because the cookie is never set. And that's super annoying and inconvenient for our users. And in my last video, I kind of inferred that we should be using JWTs in single page applications going forward in 2022. So I thought, heck, why not just convert this application to use JWTs and document the process for you? So the first thing we're going to do is install a package. So the package is called JSON Web Token. And we're going to delete any trace of server-side sessions right away. So I want to delete the Redis store. We're not using the Redis client in this file anymore. We're not even using this function anymore. So just get rid of all that. And in our index.js, we get rid of these imports and make sure our application doesn't use that session middleware anymore. And also in socket.io, we're using it over here to authorize our users. I'll comment that out for now because we have to replace it later to use kind of the similar logic but with JWTs. And over here, when we initialize a user, we're getting the session information and sticking it in the socket.user object. So I'm going to comment that out because we're going to do the same thing later but not with the session. So now the first thing we got to do is change the login logic. So when a user logs in and the username matches a user, so we go here, and if the password matches, that means they're going to log in right now. We want to take off this session thing and replace it by creating a JWT. So up here, we would just want to import JWT from JSON Web Token. And then we can just go down here and create a token by doing jwt.sign. And the first argument it takes is the payload. So that would be this object right here. And then the second argument it takes is the secret. So the secret seed used to do the encryption. So over here in my .env file, I already created a secret. And that's what we're going to reference. So up here, you would do require.env.config to load those environment variables. And then here we just pass in that secret from the environment variable. Then it takes the options. So in the documentation, I have it open here. And it shows us that the options takes in many props. It could take in the algorithm that you want to specify, the issuer, the subject, a bunch of cool stuff. But the most important thing it takes is the expiration time. And that's really the only thing we need to specify in our use case. So we want to pass in expires in. And in this case, we're going to do 2 minutes or 1 minute because I want to test out the logic when a JWT expires. And the last argument it takes is a callback. So when this is done doing it asynchronously, it calls this function and passes in the error and the token. And so here we do our logic. So if there's an error, we want to respond with res.json logged in is false. And then we'll give them a status message of something went wrong. Try again later, and then return from here. And so if nothing went wrong, then we would respond with logged in being true, and we just pass in that token. And so now we can just get rid of this up here, and it's pretty much all we needed to do, and get rid of this also. And so we're going to be doing this same exact thing when we register an account. But the thing is that I really don't like using callbacks. That looks ugly to me. So I'm just going to convert this to use promises instead. So we can do .then and .catch. So here we're going to create a folder called JWT. and inside of it, it's going to be called JWT auth.js. And here we can import our .env variables and also import the JSON Web Token library. And so here we want to create a function called JWT sign, and it takes in a payload, a secret, and some options. And it just returns a promise, so it can be asynchronous. And then the promise, every promise has a resolve and a reject. And so here in this promise, we would want to do jwt.sign with the payload, secret, options, and then we do that callback. But this time, if there's an error, we just reject the promise with the error, and then otherwise we would resolve our promise with the token. And so now we just do module.exports and export this function. So over here in our login, instead of doing this stuff, we can get rid of this callback right here. And we can change this to our function that we created. And then we can do .then, and then we get our token. And then we want to obviously do the same response that I should have copied over. And then here we can do .catch and then error. We want to console log the error. And then we want to do respond.json logged in is false and status try again later. No, I'm just kidding. I'll keep it with one R. And so here you need to separate that. Okay. So yeah, I just personally like using promises more than callbacks. And so I'm just going to copy this over into this file right here. And I'm just copy the payload, paste it like that, and then it's pretty much the same exact thing. Just like that. So we're creating the token when the user logs in or registers an account. So now we want to handle the login. So let's say our users has the token in local storage and they send over a request when they go to our page for the first time. And that's over here in my handle login function. Currently we're using sessions to handle that, and we're not going to be doing that anymore. So I just want to create a function kind of similar to this one. It returns a promise, but I wanted to do it to verify the JWT. But first I'm going to do it like normally, like how they do it in the documentation, and then I'll make it a promise real quick. So the first thing we would want to do is actually get the JWT from the header of the request. So we do request.headers and access the authorization header, and then we would do .split and then on the space. So that means whenever there's a space, just split the string into an array and separate the string wherever there is a space. And so we would want to get the second value from that array, because the header would be like something like this, so bearer and then the token. So we want to get the actual token, but it might be that the user doesn't even have a token, so this was not sent. So we want to make sure we do this question mark here, which basically means like if this is not null, then run this on it, and if it's null, then just stop right there and return null. So then we want to save this, and this would be our token that we've sent. And so now we would just want to verify that this token is correct. So here we would just import, first of all, the JWT library. So const JWT is require JSON web token, and then we would go here and do jwt.verify, pass in the token, and we need to get our environment variable again. So require .env.config, and then here's process.env.jwt secret, and then the options, sorry. And over here we can see in the documentation the options that we can pass into it. So we can pass in these options here, but we really don't need to pass in any options, so we're not going to do that. We're just going to pass in a callback, and this returns us the error and the decoded token. So if there's an error, we would want to run this over here, and if there's, or no, sorry, we would run this over here, and if there's not an error, we run this, so logged in is true. And instead of passing the username, we passed in token. Just like that, we pass in the original token back to them. We don't really have to, but I'm just going to do it either way. And we're going to be reusing this, so I'm just going to make it a little bit more portable. So over here, I'm going to create a function called JWT verify. Takes in a token and a secret, and it returns a new promise. And this has the resolve, reject, oops. So here all we would do is jwt.verify, and we want to verify the token with the supplied secret. And then the callback has an error, the decoded token, and if there's an error, we reject the promise with that error, and if not, we just resolve it with the decoded token. So then we want to export that. And you might be thinking, well, why are you doing this? Well, I'm just having fun, you know, making things promises instead of callbacks. You don't have to do that though. So over here, we would change this to JWT verify, and we would do .then with the decoded token, which we're not going to really use in this case. And then we would do that, and then we do .catch with the error, and then we want to log that error in case we get a bug in our code, and then respond with logged in as false. So then now we can get rid of this stuff right here. It's a little prettier now, and we can get rid of this callback here, and we can just keep it like that. And we're also going to be reusing this code. So over here, I'm going to create another function called get JWT, takes in request, and it just does an instant return, and we'll just be returning this over here. So just like that, and we want to export that. And this is how you really make your code a lot more readable. I'll tell you that. This helps a lot. Whether they believe it or not, it actually does. So here we do JWT, or no, get JWT, pass in our request. So here we want to do a base case. So basically, if there's no token, then we just do res.json of this down here and return right away. So that should help us not get errors so often. And so now that we're using JWTs in our Express application when we're doing authentication, we want to make it so that Socket.io also uses authentication. So here in our Socket.io server, when we're authorizing our users, and I mentioned we were going to replace this, and we're going to do that right now. So Socket.io does things a little bit differently, and it's really easy to send over JWTs. It's kind of like they prepared for it, and they have this thing called a handshake, and it has an auth object, so you don't really have to pass it through the headers. So here we can do const token is equal to socket.handshake.auth, and then we would pass in as .token from the front end. So this is passed in on our initial Socket.io connection, and it gets encrypted and all that good stuff. So I want to do some logging here. So I want to log the token so then I can see if everything's going right. And here we'll do JWT verify on the promise that we created, pass in the token, and we need to get our environment variables in here. And then over here, we'd pass in process.env.jwt secret. And then we would do .then, and then we have our decoded token. And then here we would do socket.user is equal to whatever we stored in the JWT. And then we can call next. And then if there's an error, we get that error. And I'm getting an error. Let me fix that. Okay. And so if there's an error, first of all, basically the same thing as we're doing here. Nothing different. So here we would just go like that and uncomment these things, and there we go. Now we can get rid of this. Oops, we can get rid of this. And perfect. So here we would pass, we want to log the error that happened. Awesome, and that's pretty much it on the backend. So we're using JWT when our user logs in, when they register, and when they log in. So when they first go to the page, we just check if they're already logged in or not. Then in our Socket.io backend, when they make that initial Socket.io connection, we're getting their token and just verifying that it's real. And if it's real, then we continue from the Socket.io middleware. So we just authorize them and they can go ahead. And here we can just delete this because we moved that functionality to over here. So now we're good on the back end. Hopefully there's no bugs. And let's go to our front end. So you notice that we passed in our token. Well, let me show you. I shouldn't have closed that. Over here in our Socket.io handshake, we need to do that on the front end. So I want to actually store the token in local storage. So we're sending a response to our client and the token is in the response. So we want to handle that. So I'm just going to go over here in our components in the login component. So when a user logs in and signs up. And over here, when we get a response, when we log in, we're saving the token in our context, but we also want to save the token in local storage. So here we'll do local storage.set item. And we're going to call this one token. And we just want to save it to data.token. And so we want to do the same thing when a user first signs up. We can stick that over here. So if the login actually happened, we save the token. So I don't want to save null or nothing like that. So now that we're saving the token in our context, we want to actually send it over when our user refreshes the page. So over here in our context, this loads every time, this use effect runs every time our user navigates to our application. Over here, when we're sending over the cookies and we're saying credentials include, we can send over a header and the header will contain our JWT. And that's pretty easy to do. So over here, you can specify the headers of your fetch request and we would just do authorization, set it to bearer and then our token, which we can get from user.token. And then over here, when we initialize our application, we want to initialize token to local storage.getItem token, like that. So we're getting our token from local storage, sticking it in our context by default, and we're sending it over on that initial load of our application. So after the user logs in, they're going to have this token in their context and we can just stick it in the Socket.io connection. So over here in socket.js, you see that we're connecting and we're creating this variable here, which is the connection itself. Socket.io makes it really easy. Like I mentioned, you can specify auth and whatever you put in here is sent to socket.handshake.auth. So here we would just send over our token, but it's saved in our context. So one thing we can do is actually convert this to a function that takes in our user context as a parameter, and it just returns this connection, but the connection has access to this user parameter, and we can do in our auth object, just pass in token equal to user.token. So now since this is a function, and we're sending over the token in the handshake and everything. What we want to do is we want to call this function, and we want to hold a reference to just one connection that we return. Because right now at the moment in our application, we were just accessing this one connection from our socket file. But now since our socket variable is a function, we can't just access it by accessing the function. We want to actually call this function and store what it returns. And that's pretty simple. So we want to store that in the top of our application. So here in our home component, we could store it. And I'm just going to create a context for that. So I'm going to call it socket context. And then I'm going to wrap our application in that. So here we're going to render this component, the socket context.provider, like that. And then the value that we pass in is going to be our socket connection. So we can pass in socket. And we'll create that right now. So we can store that in a state. So over here, I'm just going to go and do const socket set socket is equal to use state. And it's going to be initialized as whatever the function returns. So I'm going to have to import this function in this component. So I'm going to do import socket from that file, but I have to rename it because this is already called socket down here. So I'll just rename it to socket con. And then here we just call socket con. We pass in our user. But then we're going to need to access our user. So I can go here and do const user is equal to use context and account context. And so that should work. So we're initializing our first socket connection. And then every time the user changes, so let's say the token changes or they log out and log back in, we want to reset our connection. So we can do a use effect like this and have it run whenever our user changes. And so this is basically going to do set socket and then a new connection, and we pass in our user. And that's pretty much it. That's saving our connection. And then over here, whenever we want to reference that connection, instead of importing it from that file, we just access it from our context that we created. And here passing socket context. And the same thing in this file over here. No, I'm sorry, not this file. It was in the add friend modal. Yeah, the add friend modal. We were accessing our socket.io connection right here when we want to add a friend. So I'm just going to save all the files in our application and I'm going to test it out. So here we see there's a bug. Session nodes were not defined. I forgot to delete these exports, so I'm just going to go and do that real quick. So here we just delete that. And it looks like we have another error. And we're logging our JWT, albeit twice for some reason. But it says here get JWT is not defined. So over here in handle login, we forgot to import that function. So let me find that, okay. And we forgot to import that. So I'm gonna try again, I'm gonna refresh. And here we logged out the JWT when we logged in. So that's over here in our authorized user function. When we're authorizing them to be able to use socket.io, we're logging out through token. Okay, so 2 minutes have passed and our token has expired. And I'm gonna refresh the page and check the console down here. Okay, and let me just try to log in again. And there we go, we're logging in again. And I'm gonna try to add a friend. Okay, so I found the bug and basically I forgot to change it here. So we're still importing the socket how we were before. And basically we just want to change that. And we can just let socket be passed in as an argument. And then over here in our home component, we just pass in socket as an argument. So now our token has expired. So I'm just going to log in one more time. And I'm going to try adding a friend. And over here, we're missing a dependency. So I'm going to add socket as a dependency and try to add a friend. And there you go. Our server is responding to us. And when we try to add ourselves, there we go. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you learned something and I was able to provide some value to you. And I hope you have a great day. I'll see you next time.